Very happy to welcome you all to this fifth lecture of the series History of Israel. Last week we had ended up talking about the British famous declaration, Balfour Declaration, which had recognized that the Jewish people had a historic right to the to be in the land of Israel. And on November 2, 1917, the Foreign Minister of Britain, Lord Balfour, addresses a letter to Lord Rothschild saying, His Majesty's government looks with favor upon the establishment in Palestine of a national homeland for the Jewish people. However beautiful this looks, the original declaration would have been stronger, would have said to say that Palestine would be the national homeland for the Jewish people, the whole of Palestine. And just as they did for Iraq and for Lebanon and for Syria and eventually for Jordan. But for the Jews, it was not Palestine as the national homeland, but rather a national homeland in Palestine, which means that part of Palestine would be given to other nations. Nevertheless, despite this was a great hope for the Jewish people, and it had generated a lot of enthusiasm. However, and the first commissioner, High Commissioner of Palestine, was a Jew, Herbert Samuel, who tried to do a good job balancing, as we discussed, the needs of the Jews together with the Arabs. We now come to the development of the Jewish settlement in Palestine. By the 1919, we begin to see a new way. We had spoken about the first Aliyah in 1881, Aliyah Rishonah, Aliyah Aleph, the second Aliyah that begins in the year 1905, mostly as a result of the Russian pogroms, and essentially that's when a lot of the socialist Jews come in, like Ben Gurion, Ben Tzvi, and so on. And now in the third, which the second Aliyah had done a great deal to create a lot of movement in the cooperative settlements, and we see actually now in the third Aliyah, which begins in the year 1919, 33,000 Jews are going to come in the next 4 years. I want to point out that many of them are socialist, again, and they come with socialist convictions, and they create these collective villages called the Chalutzit. Shomer HaTzair is a very important movement in this. And they have these fanatical ideas of abolishing the family as a social unit, for example, and work total, no private property. And, kibbutz life develops in many colonies like this. On the other hand, the capitalists, what we call capitalist colonies, cities like Rehovot, Petach Tikva, Ra'anana, Pardes Chana, Netanya, Ramatayim, Herzliya, Bnei Brak, all of these are already in functioning, and these are all that do not work as cooperatives. They're all individual, private property, what we call capitalist societies. So by the mid-30s, we're going to see 40 capitalist villages and a great deal of work that is being done in populating Israel. But the political power is going to go mostly to the kibbutzim. And this is interesting, partly because they function more as groups and they have more leverage. And the greatest contribution of the kibbutzim and is to defend the laborers, the workers in capitalist cities need defense, and they create like unions, and that's called the Histadrut. The Histadrut, the gray labor union, is controlled by these labor Zionists, and they begin to create a lot of these institutions that are going eventually to shape the ideological landscape of the state of Israel until very recently. Um, in this period of time, the 1920s, we are now having 40 cities, capitalist cities, and 110 agricultural settlements. You would say, what? At the beginning of the century, there was none, or they were dying. And now in 20 years, we have 150 different locations where Jews are thriving. This is unbelievable. The Histadrut creates its own company. You may have heard Solel Bonet, the first great construction company. And one of the reasons that Solel Bonet is necessary is that a lot of Jews, particularly from Poland, are coming in this aliyah. And although they do not come with any particular skills, but we need to house them. And they are, so we need a lot of construction. During this period of time, we see the growth of industry, electric power in Tel Aviv, salt works, potash in the Dead Sea, a cement factory, and of course, construction.
What year are you in?
1920, 25. And we are talking here about this organization that begins to shape what we talk about, what we call this like the beginning of a state. So we have a labor union, you have cities, we have agricultural settlements, but now you need an organization or a group that is going to consolidate and control all of this, representing the Jewish community to the British mandate. So the British mandate is the main legal authority, but under it, the colonies, the Jewish and the Arab colonies, have to be represented. So the Jews created what is called the Jewish Agency in 1929, supported by many Zionists outside of Eretz Israel, like the famous Supreme Court Justice Louis Marshall, Brandeis. So the Jews are in a way organized with the Jewish Agency. And we would have expected the Arabs to have an Arab agency so that they would be able to have two competing and parallel organizations, maybe eventually to work together. The problem is, as we will see, that the Arabs never created an Arab agency. The Arabs are always angry and they don't create anything. And when they're unhappy, they riot. So we will talk about this development a little bit later. But let me continue with the Jewish people. So we have cities, we have colonies, we have the Hebrew University, important, incredible, a great university with very important scholars, Joseph Klausner, Martin Buber. We will talk more about these people in a moment. But I just want to point out what you have in this development from the 1919, after the Balfour Declaration, till about 1930, these 11 years we're discussing here. We also create what is called chief rabbis. Rav Kook is selected as the rabbi of the Ashkenazi community, and the Yaakov Meir is selected as the rabbi of the Sephardi. This rabbi called Yaakov Meir Mercado had been the rabbi in Salonika, a very important community in Greece, and he is called to become the chief rabbi of the Sephardi community. So we have here this development in Israel, in Palestine, of these unions, universities, theater. Abima Theater is already created. Bialik, Achadaam, Chernichovsky, all of these great personalities living in Israel. I want to point out, by the way, the growth of Israel in the 1920s. Just listen to these numbers. We discussed last week the growth of Tel Aviv in 1908, 1910. By 1921, there are only 3,000 Jews in Tel Aviv. 1921. In the same year, the population, in 1 year, the population of Tel Aviv triples, partly because of the Polish Jews. So there are 9,000 to 10,000 Jews in 1921. In 1924, 5 years later, there's 16,000. And by 1929, with 46, almost 50,000 Jews in Tel Aviv. So in the less than the 8 years, it goes from 3,000 to 46,000. That is the effect of the immigration. That's the third aliyah. That is the Jews who come from Poland, from Russia. Um, so just to show you the development of the Jews, the death rate in the Yishuv was among the lowest in the world. 11 deaths per 1,000. We talked briefly about parties. We talked about the Labor Party dominating because of the Histadrut. They dominate the institutions. The Histadrut, the Jewish Agency, that's why Ben Gurion becomes such an important person. And that group is going to shape the ideology and the institutions of the Yishuv and later of the State of Israel. And until the rise of Begin and Netanyahu, the labor and the left in Israel was totally dominant. However, there are other parties. Another party that represents the interests of the capitalists, the interests of the non-communists in Israel is the Jabotinsky party. Jabotinsky is particularly upset with the leftists because the leftists were not being assertive enough in the relationship with the British. They were too accommodating, they were too meek, and Jabotinsky, thinks that we need to be stronger. We have to establish a Jewish state on both sides of the Jordan, not to appease the British, and he creates what is called the Revisionist Party, which eventually is going to become what we call the Likud. So you have the Labor, which is the Mapai, and all the leftist parties in Israel, the most important being Mapai. Mapai, by the way, is the initials of Mifleget Poalei Eretz Israel. It's a labor group, eventually becomes Labor, Avodah. And then we have the Jabotinsky. And then there's also a religious party called Mizrahi, because now it's going to take the interest of the Jews, of the religious Jews in Israel. So this is what's happening in the 1920s. A very important aspect of this, which I want to clarify a little bit, is what happens with the Arabs. And as we discussed last week, the Arabs are a problem because they are not interested in peace. They're not interested in living together. They simply have the blood in their eyes, and they want to see the Jews out. And they do not create any institution representing the Arabs. The Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, Aj Amin al-Husseini, is an instigator of riots. And the British enable that violence. And it's interesting that the British wanted to have a representative government. Listen to this. A representative government which would be elected democratically. Given that the Jews were not even 1/3 of the population of Palestine, it is clear that the Arabs would have dominated all the institutions. And we would have had a state, a binational state, or an Arab state, a state that would be dominated by the Arabs. That's what the British wanted. Fortunately, from this peril, as from many others, the Zionists were rescued by the Arabs themselves. I remember once when Shimon Peres was the prime minister of Israel, he wanted to give up some territory to the Arabs. And I went to one of the rabbis, Rabbi Goren, and I told him, what's going to happen? How are we going to lose all of these towns and all the villages? And he said to me, don't worry. The Jews always want to give. The Arabs won't let us. And that is so true. The Arabs would never let us give them something because they're always asking for more. So the Zionists were saved by the fact that the Arabs did not want to have an Arab representation. So the Jewish community continued to develop its own policy away from the Arabs in connection with the British. So here we see the seeds of the Arab-Jewish confrontation. The Arabs, all they want is to destroy us and to destroy our, and to stop, above all, to install the immigration. By the way, Palestine is the only place in the world where immigration exceeds immigration. More people coming in than going out. And the Jews are providing jobs for the Arabs. Now, it is true that there were Arabs in Palestine. In 1882, there were 250,000 Arabs. But there were Jews, as we said, maybe 6,000. But by 1914, the Arab population doubles. And by the end of 1930, the Arab population is 850,000. All of this is growth because they come to work in the wineries, in the citrus orchards, and so on. The Jews, by the way, from 1922 to 1931, grow even more exponentially. In 1922, there are only 80,000 Jews in Israel. That's all. 1 decade later, 1931, 1937, 15 later, 400,000 Jews. So many Jews tried to work together with the Arabs, and they wanted to have cooperation, to want to have peace, work together. The British were really artificial. The people who should have controlled Palestine were the Jews and the Arabs, but the Arabs never wanted to work with the Jews. The envy of the Jews. The British also, by the principle of divide and conquer, didn't want to have union of the Jews and the Arabs. So they usually sometimes torpedoed meetings. So they prevented the creation of a cooperation. And as we see later, this is actually good for us. Because had there been some cooperation, the creation of a democratic institution, parliament, represented by all the people of the country, would have given the Arabs a total majority. There would have been no state of Israel. So in a way, ironically, we owe the state of Israel to the enmity of the Arabs. Had they been nice and good and cooperative, they would have won. So the Arabs, the leader of the Arabs is Haj Amin al-Husseini, a man of great hatred, Mufti since 1922, and we will see that in the 30s he becomes in love with Hitler, because Hitler is talking about killing the Jews. What a wonderful idea! And he eventually goes to Berlin to meet him. Something happens, just to give you an example. In 1928, on Yom Kippur, that year was September 24. A shamish, in organizing of the services, put a little screen, a mechitza, between the men and the women, so the women could come to the kotel. The Arabs complained that this was a breach of the status quo, but they were not allowed to put a mechitza. And that day they start construction and to make noise to the Jews. They did not let them work, and demonstrations, and the British are trying to negotiate some sort of compromise between the two parties. And finally, the Mufti says the Jews want to control Al-Aqsa. So that's nothing new. Just started already then. Nothing new. They want to take the Al-Aqsa. So they instigated a major demonstration in 1929, August 23. Crowds of Arabs with weapons enter Jerusalem, attack Orthodox Jewish quarters. They come to Hebron. They leave 60 people dead. Also Haifa, Jaffa. By the way, in 1929, the chaos continues until August 28th for 5 days. That is the last time that the Jews are in Hebron until the 6-day war. 1929, the Jews leave Hebron because of the massacre. And the description of what happened was too awful to contemplate. Bloody, killing young children, blood all over in front of synagogues and in the books. So now the British have to conduct an inquiry. What happened? What was the problem? What was this violence? And you know what they concluded? And this is perhaps the crux of this lecture. They concluded with a horrible decision. First of all, they said, the British said the violence was condemned on both sides. The Jews had done nothing. They were the victims. But they condemned violence on both sides. Something very similar that we were going to see, during some American administrations, where the Arabs attack and they talk about ending the cycle of violence, as if there's a cycle, not an attacker and a victim, but everybody is attacking each other. And that's what the British start to say. So the British now, great solution. How are we going to stop the violence? I mean, obviously, it was started by the Arabs, but how are we going to stop this problem? So they issue what is called the Passfield White Paper in 1930. The White Paper says essentially that we have to limit Jewish immigration. Too many Jews. They concede that. Weizmann writes in his diary that when he entered the hall of the foreign minister, Passfield, to receive what the British were going to do about these terrible riots that had left so many Jewish victims, he felt a sense of icy climate. And he left the meeting pale and in tears. He never expected the British to have done what they did. Instead of condemning the violence, instead of stepping in and putting an end to these criminal actions, they issued a paper that essentially punished the Jews, the Passfield White Paper. And so the British now oppose mass Jewish immigration. Weizmann senses the chill, and he feels that the British have repudiated the principle of the Balfour Declaration and the decision of San Remo and the League of Nations 3 years later. So now the Jews realize they don't have the support of Britain, and the Commission result is very disappointing. They cave in to the Arabs, and so some Jews were more conciliatory, like Ben Gurion and others, but actually the Jews realize that they need to take care of themselves. They're not going to leave the defense of the Jewish people to the British. And now we begin to see the beginning, what is called Jewish self-defense, the Haganah. It is interesting that we're talking here about the beginning of the 30s. 1930 is the Passfield Paper. The Jews are beginning to see that something is wrong with the British. And it is precisely at this time that the Jews in Europe are beginning to feel that they need to have a refuge, a place to go out. And we are going to see a major confrontation between the more meek and quiet diplomatic maneuvers of Ben Gurion and the more aggressive, assertive policies of Jabotinsky. That is going to begin that great rift between these two leaders. Ben Gurion on the one hand, the labor Zionists on one side, and Jabotinsky, the book of the revisionists, on the other side. And these two major powers are going to fight it out in the 30s. And this will be the subject of next week's lecture as well.